Welcome back to Powered by Play. I'm Drew, and I'm a professor of theater at Chapman University in Southern California.
I'm Avery, and I'm a theatrical scenic designer. Every month on this podcast, we explore what we play, how we play, and why we play.
We believe play powers us, and that's what makes it powerful.
All right, Drew.
All right, Avery.
Press play.
Welcome back to Powered by Play. This month, we are talking about playing the future. We're going to be covering topics like how do we think about and imagine what could happen days, weeks, years from now, and how do we play both in science fiction and in the real world looking at near future technology. And I'm very, very excited for this topic and excited to talk about kind of the beginnings of my fascination with science fiction when I was a little kid. And I need to introduce our guest for this particular episode. My guest is someone I have known almost my entire life. So it gives me great pleasure to bring my sister Brooke into the podcast studio, and I'll let her introduce herself a little bit.
Hi, I am Brooke Chappell, and my main qualification for being here, I would say, is that I am Drew's sister, and I am kind of the person that he tends to talk about content of this show when he's not talking about it on the show or actively teaching a class. I do not have many official qualifications. I am mostly just somebody who has been involved in fandom for pretty much all of my life, different corners of it at different times. And I've also done things like worked in a comic book shop or a game shop or spent too much time on the internet. So I have thoughts about the kinds of things that you guys usually talk about, and Drew thought it would be good for me to come on.
That's amazing. That's really cool. Thanks for being here, Brooke.
Of course.
Okay, I thought we could get started this way. Memories of thinking about the future when we were kids, when we were young. I remember, of course, since I was a kid when the original Star Wars trilogy was out, watching that trilogy and just thinking, wow, if the future looks like this, it's going to be exciting. And I remember thinking about, do I identify more with Luke and the Jedi or Han Solo and the kind of roguish heroes that he represented? Star Wars, I think, created a huge landscape for Gen Xers, and I'll probably come back to it as we go along. Doctor Who. So Doctor Who, when I was a kid and when Brooke was very, very young, we spent almost a year in England because my dad did a job exchange, taking the job of not taking a job like he stole it from this person, but trading a job with a guy who worked at a university in England. And so we were exposed to a lot of British TV that hadn't come over to the States, including Doctor Who. I really associate Doctor Who with the fourth Doctor, Tom Baker. And I think he was one of the longest running doctors.
He's the one with the long scarf.
Yes, he's the one with the long scarf and the floppy hat. And my goodness, he had adventures, and those also sort of folded into what I was thinking of as, ooh, what could the future look like? Even though he was often contemporary with stuff that was going on at the world at that time, he also sort of went into the future and into the past. He had a lot of wiggle room to explore a lot of different places. Choose Your Own Adventure books. There were a lot of science fiction Choose Your Own Adventure books. Each one was a little different. I remember specifically The Third Planet from Altair. I can't remember which number it was. It may have been 7. And you were exploring this planet with carnivorous plants, and you were in charge of kind of an away team, and you went and investigated. Oh, and Star Trek as well. And the weekly, especially when I was a teenager, used to watch Star Trek: The Next Generation with Brooke and with our dad. That was always a really fun bonding, the three of us. Our mom was not a science fiction person, and so the three of us would watch Star Trek Next Gen and she would be doing something in another room or very specifically saying that is not my cup of tea. So a lot of Star Trek also influenced how I thought about the future at that time. I remember thinking about what if I had my own ship, my own little ship? What if I could go where I wanted, meet interesting creatures? And this pull for exploration, interplanetary exploration, probably these visions were influenced by the pulp adventures, the daring spaceman, and yeah, usually gendered male trope that was going on that was still holding on from like the pulp fiction of the 50s, 60s, a little bit 70s. But there was very much a if you had a little spaceship and you could go wherever you wanted, what kind of adventures would you have? Also, I used to build Lego spaceships with my friends, and we would fly them around the house and we would pretend that we were landing on different planets. So a sofa was a planet, a table was a planet, a desk was a planet, and each planet we would kind of set up with different Lego stuff, and it was a lot of fun. So as a kid, the future was freedom, the future was adventure, the future was a sense of things were going to be better and things were going to be more fun. So that's from childhood what I remember. How about you, Brooke?
Well, some of our stuff overlaps, obviously. It's kind of hard to overstate how big Star Wars was as a cultural influence when we were kids. I do believe that I dressed up as Leia for Halloween once. I think, although I am going to hit you with a well, actually, Drew, because technically Star Wars is not the future, it's a galaxy far, far away, long, long ago. So, and that's a thing that you actually see a lot in science fiction is, are we in the future or are we in the past? That's a big thing in like Battlestar Galactica, for example, and sort of cycles of history. And then there's also the fact that a lot of science fiction is based on past events. So, how many science fiction worlds have been created based off of the Roman Empire, for example. So that's part of what I tend to find really interesting in science fiction because I'm also a really big history buff. Drew and I both were into history growing up. He was into the Roman Empire, and I tended to be into whatever culture the Roman Empire happened to be fighting. So I was into the Greeks, I was into the Egyptians, I was into the Celts. Never really gotten into the Carthaginians, but anyway, the thing about it was that I did not have quite as much of a utopian sort of bent as I think Drew did in my play. I think that when I was imagining the future, I was more imagining like the near future and a future for myself. Being a ballerina, rock star, gymnast, whatever. But also, I wanted for several years to be an architect. And so I would draw my future houses and I would flip through magazines or catalogs and come up with very elaborate fantasies of, oh, well, I'm going to travel to this place. These are the things that I'm going to have in my house. These are the various adventures that I'm going to have in my future. And I think that was more where I was coming from. Star Trek was also a very big influence for me. And I think that insofar as I fantasized about being in a sci-fi fiction world, it would usually be the Star Trek universe. And I would imagine hanging out in 10 Forward with the characters or going on adventures with Q or what have you. Back to the more immediate future, I think one thing that I found really interesting when I was a kid was time capsules and the idea of trying to sum up your life and experience and the things that are important to you at a certain time, whether as part of a group or individually, and imagining a future in which somebody would be opening that. And I also tended and still sometimes do like to imagine interacting with somebody who is a time traveler, whether from the past or the future, and explaining what I'm doing, like as I'm, I don't know, cooking or driving or what have you, explaining to them, well, this is why I'm doing it this way, and this is the tools that I'm using, this is the history of how certain things got to be the way they are. But I remember that there was a time capsule that I did in elementary school as my elementary school group, and we were supposed to come back like in 25 years and dig it up. And I did end up going on the date that we were supposed to go on. And unfortunately, I was the only one there. And I think that the time capsule, if the teacher had actually buried it, as he said he was going to, probably would have been moved or something, because, of course, the elementary school was remodeled. I think that I just generally tend to think about the future very much in conversation with the past.
I also really relate to like writing letters to our future selves, where you get to talk about who you are now and you're wondering all about who you are later. I recently watched a Korean drama with my partner about a couple, and during it, they do agree to do a time capsule thing because one of them has time traveling powers. And there's also like the romance of it. It's kind of like carving your name into a tree, where you're like, oh, this is for everybody else. This is for the future. We'll come back to it. And hopefully things are just as happy later on as they are when you carve your name into the tree. But yeah, it's really all about your hopes and wishes and curiosities for me when I think about doing letters and projects like that. I also really loved Choose Your Own Adventure, Drew. We've talked about it a bunch of times on this podcast already, too. And I remember the feeling of the space themed books for those because everything's completely unknown and unfamiliar. And it's like, do you talk to this moving plant? Or do you unearth this strange, mysterious rock? Because I think it adds the element of unknown to the choose your own adventure genre where anything, literally anything could happen. So it's that much more exciting. Another aspect of choices was also in the butterfly effect in games like Until Dawn, which is like a horror themed one, Life is Strange, which is like a high school themed one, Undertale, which is kind of a pixelated indie game where you can choose to save monsters or attack them. And even in like the Walking Dead video game of from Telltale, you get to choose who to be nice to, who to give extra food to, and there's always in the post-apocalyptic zombie things, there's always that scene where you and your allies are in a house, and then outside the door, somebody's knocking, trying to get let in for shelter, and you have to choose whether to let the person in or not because they could be a danger, they could be an ally, they could be a monster pretending to be a human. They could be someone who's already been zombified. Yeah, and I guess the zombies are also a huge part of the future too, now that I think about it, because it is kind of about what happens to us later on. And I was also very paranoid about the apocalypse when I was younger. I grew up with OCD, and one of my paranoias was that the sun was going to explode while I am alive. And I still partially feel that way a little bit, if I'm being honest. I feel like the sun might explode when we get older, but hopefully not. One more thing now is that as a graduating grad student soon enough, I am looking up places to move, to live, to work later on, and looking at jobs anywhere in the world. And I haven't been able to do this in a while. The last time I had this kind of freedom was at the end of my undergrad. And now I'm playing again where I get to look up Canada, where I get to look up Maine and Oregon and find out wherever it is that I would like to be in the future and kind of imagine my life there. I think being more playful with it definitely takes out the scariness of it and all the unknown factors.
Yeah, the future, I think when we sort of sum up, we'll talk about What does the future mean? What is empowering about the future? That'll be an interesting discussion. And both of you were talking about anything is possible in science fiction, which I also really resonated with, right? I'm going to quote or talk about my favorite author, who here in the States is not as well known, but in the UK he's very well known. He was a Scottish author named Ian Banks, and his science fiction stuff was written under Ian M. Banks, and he talked about the literally anything you could imagine you could write in science fiction. You could go forward in time, you could go backward in time, you could go to a completely different kind of society. You could go into the mind of an alien. You could go into the mind of an AI supercomputer controlling a ship. I think that that's part of the freedom, and part of the lack of restriction is something that allows us to be almost completely playful and imagine whatever. There are, however, some tropes. And so maybe we can cover a couple of tropes that we see in science fiction a lot. I wrote down small ships versus capital ships. Small ships, maneuverable, like shuttles in Star Trek, or like X-Wings in Star Wars. You could move very quickly. They were good dogfight type ships. And of course, the Millennium Falcon and the way it maneuvered through canyons and things like that. And then capital ships that carried huge groups of people, the Empire's big star destroyers, or even big ships like the ship in Wall-E that had the Axiom, I think it was called, and it carried a whole society going to live somewhere completely different, or the Battlestar Galactica ships that were going to repopulate a planet. And the conversation, I think, between the small ships and the big ships was really interesting. What could you do with a small ship? What could you do with a big ship? And then faster than light travel. Well, if you're going to go to different planets and different galaxies, then or different solar systems, then you're going to need to travel faster than the speed of light. How do you do that? So light speed in Star Trek and Star Wars, and warp drive in Star Trek, and the bubble that allows the ships to move. And of course, aliens. And aliens, anything from the tiniest little speck of life to an incredibly powerful alien presence that showed up in maybe a Marvel comic or something like that, right? Like the planet eating Galacticus. Anything was possible with aliens and how they interacted with human beings. I think that a lot of the shows that we watched tended to have aliens that were quite a bit like humans, because they were humans wearing alien costumes. So early Doctor Who and early Star Trek and even Star Wars, if you look at characters like Greedo or Chewbacca or someone like that, they're still pretty much like they have two legs, two arms, and some kind of head, and they sort of look human-esque. And so aliens had kind of a pattern that would allow human beings to play them in movies, in TV, and even in plays, very early science fiction plays too. So, some tropes, Brooke?
I was always very into aliens as well. I think that I'm generally into the sci-fi tropes that are about nature of what it means to be human, the nature of what it means to be sentient or to have a soul, all of that kind of thing, which is very much something that you see with aliens and also with robots or androids or artificial intelligence. I will say, Drew, that I think Marina Sirtis, who played Deanna Troi in Star Trek The Next Generation, has a notable anecdote about a fan who asked her, well, why is it that so many of the aliens are humanoid? And she says very dryly, well, if you know of any good non-humanoid actors, I'm sure they would be interested to know. That is something that I always find interesting when there's a very unhuman seeming kind of alien. I think that probably there could be more done with aliens who don't have bilateral symmetry or aliens who do not communicate in a way that is comprehensible. One of the books that was an influence on, I think, Drew and myself growing up was Ender's Game, which is very relevant to play because the whole setup there is that there are kids who are playing basically video games in order to conduct a war. One of the things that's really interesting in that book, much as I have qualms about reading Orson Scott Card these days, one of the things that he did very well was talk about different kinds of consciousness. The aliens in Ender's Game are the buggers, and they are insectoid, and they also have a sort of hive mind. And so individuals are not significant to the same extent. And so what you ultimately find out is that the initial event that kicked off the war was they had landed and just killed a human colony because they didn't really understand that these were each individual lives that they were cutting off. They were just sort of thinking that they were pruning back this other species. So I find that really interesting. In terms of robots and androids, Data on Star Trek was very much my favorite character as a kid. And the episode A Measure of a Man, The Measure of a Man, which is about whether Data has rights, basically has human rights, is a individual, is a person versus whether or not he's property. And there's this famous speech that B. Goldberg as Guinan gives to Captain Picard, where when he's considering, what are the stakes here, where she says, well, throughout civilization, there have always been disposable people who do the jobs that nobody else wants to do. And he says, well, you're talking about slavery. And she says, well, kind of, yeah. She doesn't say kind of, yeah, but that was something that I always found really compelling. Also in, say, like Battlestar Galactica, when the new one, not the old one, when talking about the Cylons and to what extent they are people, to what extent they have rights, and, are they inherently a threat? One of the things that's interesting about Star Trek is that they tend to introduce a civilization or a people or a race of aliens and have them be very scary and threatening at the outset. And then as series goes on, or as different series come along, you will find out more about them as a civilization, and they will become more sympathetic. So, for example, in the original series, there were the Klingons, and the Klingons were a little bit of a Cold War allegory, just pretty much straightforwardly an antagonist. Whereas in The Next Generation, you had one of the main characters was a Klingon who had been raised by humans. And that was also sort of the case with numerous other civilizations like the Borg. And there's always just sort of this conversation about, like, is this species inherently unacceptable to our way of life? Or are they basically human, but having souls or sentient or sapient or whatever? And I think that's one of the recurring themes of Star Trek that I found always very interesting. Plus, I just, like robots. It's actually a little bit depressing that the AI that we're dealing with now is not the AI that I kind of hoped would be the case when I was a kid. Although there are some people who seem to be convinced that it is, in fact, like the Terminator, and there's going to be a sentient AI that takes over world. But that seems unlikely at this particular time to me.
Yeah, there is this huge philosophical question of technology taking over humanity and what makes a soul and what makes a sentient being. I think the first sci-fi movie I ever watched was I, Robot as a kid, and then a similar video game later on was Detroit Become Human, which tries to make an allegory for the civil rights movement using an android uprising as the main story. And it's all about the question of, in the future, will robots become sentient and gain free will, and then what do we do about that? So Detroit Become Human is set in Detroit in 2038. So I guess by 2038 we'll be able to see if they're correct or not. But they basically have introduced androids into everyday life for servitude. But a glitch allows them to become deviant or to act on human emotions. And this is another video game where your choices matter in the future, and not only your choices but also the public opinion of androids. So the more violent or the more non-violent you are changes whether the rest of society will allow you to become your own people, basically. And notably, it's told from the point of view of the robots, where as a player, you're meant to relate to the robots of like having the free will and having like truly human emotions. But I think from the point of view of the humans, I think iRobot does both the point of view of the robots and humans. But honestly, if I were faced with a robot uprising on the streets right now, I I would be a little scared and would probably not support them. I don't know. And that's like the whole question that sci-fi is trying to raise is like, how would you feel about all this?
I think I would hear the robots out. I mean, maybe they have good points.
Oh, okay.
Maybe they could do a better job of things. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we have multiple perspectives. And it's also interesting because this is also the question of humans as creators of technological life, like how humans created dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, or how we created some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of evil, and how it's kind of like the magic of that, the spark of creation and life is another like interesting question that sci-fi likes to deal with. And other tropes that I like to mention are all the neon, the cyberpunk cities. I love the aesthetic of like a dark city with all kinds of neon signs. The transportation of the future is brilliant. Trains that are super fast, planes that are super fast, and there's a aesthetic called solar punk, which is kind of like cyberpunk, but instead of neon and electricity and technology, it's more about natural solar energy and green life, and incorporating that into urban cities.
Solar punk is really cool, and you can find really interesting illustrations online of, more sustainable buildings that have plant life worked in, or just having things be deliberately designed to be more part of the environment.
Yeah. And then one more thing is the element of space exploration. Video games such as No Man's Sky and Astroneer are ones where you can be a little astronaut explorer and explore other foreign planets. If you really like three-dimensional renderings of beautiful planets, No Man's Sky is the way to go, because you also get to build your own spaceships, you get to harvest elements from the planets, like iron and whatnot, and deal with creatures. One amazing aspect of No Man's Sky is that you stumble across all these creatures on these other planets and you get to name them. And I would love to name them things like Ploopy, Big Boops, Meep, more, come up with all kinds of names for them.
I love that naming process. And I was just thinking of the new game Vantage, Stonemeyer Games, which is probably most famous for Wingspan. But Vantage is a game, it's a co-op or a solo game where you and your crew have all taken escape pods, and each escape pod has landed on a different part of this planet. And so you are looking at something, and only you can see the card that's in front of you. And so you can describe what you're looking at to other people on your team, but you can't show them your card because they're not there. They're somewhere else on the planet. You can communicate over communication device, but it's really interesting how you try to figure out the bigger mission, the bigger story, who's on this planet from each of you seeing a different aspect. So, yeah, exploration, that's a new game that is sort of taking what you were talking about, Avery, and going into how do we collaborate to explore a planet when we're not in the same space. So, really fun. Going back to my kind of utopic vision that I described in the very beginning here, I think there are reasons that in the 70s and 80s, like right after the moon landing in 1969, we were feeling very excited about the future in the United States. So there were things like the cartoon The Jetsons. And the Jetsons were a cartoon family where a lot of their life was taken care of by robots or automation, other kinds of things. And it was a family that was very much a mid century modern family in the future. And so there was an overworked father and a trad wife and their kids who kind of did things that were a little bit like elementary school or high school in the 1950s and 60s. The Jetsons was a really interesting kind of early retro futurist vision of what might the future look like. And then I will come back to the author Ian Banks. So most of his science fiction revolved around a future society or group collaborative collection of societies, kind of like the Federation in Star Trek, and it was called The Culture. Here's the deal with the culture. So humans and other races had turned society over to a very benign series of AI spaceships, but also just powerful AI that could do anything, really could create anything, do anything. And so wars were fought by AI. And scarcity was no longer a thing. It was a post scarcity society. Everyone had what they wanted or needed, and everyone was free to live their life, change their gender when they wanted. They were also free to enhance themselves when they wanted in order to like climb a mountain with greater ability or play piano with greater ability. And so it was a huge, just kind of, wouldn't it be utopic? Wouldn't it be great if a society could actually be like this? Of course, there were still trouble spots. Sometimes things would go wrong. Often, when the culture was meeting other civilizations that were kind of like, your utopia is not my utopia. Or when one AI would have a different idea of what to do than a different AI. And then I think of also the utopia of Disneyland back in the day, Tomorrowland. Disneyland built in 1955. And so back in the day, Tomorrowland was looking at the future of tomorrow, the world of tomorrow, the land of tomorrow. And so it had things like the house of the future, the people mover, anything that in 1955 seemed like it was coming. And anything that seemed like it was going to be helpful, it was going to, like Brooke, I think you talked about this earlier, make our lives easier or better. And so, of course, it was a very different view of the future. After 1969, with the moon landing and the supposed end to the space race, Tomorrowland changed rapidly. It was changing all the time to keep up with what did the future actually look like. And Tomorrowland keeps changing. The decor changes, the rides change, the experiences change. When Brooke and I were kids, our grandmother worked at McDonnell Douglas, and talk about looking at the future. McDonnell Douglas was thinking about like space stations and military aircraft and things like that. And so they had an attraction in Tomorrowland called Mission to Mars. Mission to Mars. And so whenever our grandparents were with us, we had to go on Mission to Mars because it was the McDonnell Douglas sponsored attraction in Tomorrowland. So you sat down and they kind of talked you through what it would be like to take a spacecraft to Mars. And it was actually fairly realistic for the time. And they would talk you through all this sort of technobabble, and we're firing the engines now. Everybody stay calm. Now we're going to land on the planet. And I think there was like one point during the whole thing where the chairs shook a little bit, and that was about as exciting as the experience got. But compare Mission to Mars and its realism with Space Mountain, which was literally the attraction right next door back in the day to Mission to Mars. Space Mountain is completely just like we're going to make up what it might be like to have a small personal spacecraft and fly as fast as you can around a solar system. And so it was all about going fast and imagining, being imaginative rather than sort of being based in realism. And so it kind of seemed to me like Mission to Mars was hard sci-fi, and I wouldn't say that Space Mountain was soft sci-fi because that would be more like psychological or cultural, but it was more dreaming or more imagination rather than what would the science of this actually be. So, what do you think, Brooke? What is still utopic? What was utopic and what's still utopic?
Well, I think it's interesting, and I have a slightly different perspective because I am 5.5 years younger than you are. So you were Gen X pretty solidly, whereas I was born in the last couple months before the switch over from Gen X to be millennial. So Avery is going to have her own perspective on all of that too. So, one of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about the whole space race concept is that we were kind of towards the end of that. And I was in elementary school when the Challenger disaster happened, and that really was a very big cultural event and something that was kind of formative for me. One of the very most common things that you would aspire to as a little kid in our generation was being an astronaut. But then this Challenger disaster happened, and that really kind of viscerally was a turning point. One of the things that I find interesting about the slightly earlier concepts of what the future would look like, what space exploration would look like, all of that, that was so kind of optimistic are some of the things that were done during the space race. It was a tremendous driver of technology in general, and not just the, rockets, etc., but understanding all kinds of science and biology and physics and all of that kind of thing. But they also were kind of making a conscious effort to imagine what humanity would be like and how it could progress. One of the things that I think is really interesting is one of the Voyager missions. They put together this thing that's called the Golden Record, which is like a vinyl record, except it's made of metal, that was encoded with all kinds of sounds from Earth. So there were people giving speeches, there were people singing, there were people having conversations. And the idea was that potentially an alien race would be able to listen to this, or it would be, again, sort of a time capsule for another civilization. There was also on the Pioneer missions, which I think were the ones before the Voyager, there's this famous plaque that has a male figure and a female figure nude, sort of holding up their hands in greeting. The idea was that a alien race might see that and then understand that we were, sexually dimorphic species, and all of these. But it's also interesting because that's always very much in the context of the time that it's coming out of. There was a big backlash to that particular plaque because the man and the woman were nude. And so there were some people who got their knickers in a twist about the lack of knickers. But I think that in a lesser way, that kind of image of the man and the woman as representatives is not quite what we would do today. Relating back to what Drew was saying about the Jetsons, I found the Jetsons fun and interesting, but also kind of frustrating because they were very much a mid-century stereotypical family. I don't know to what extent it was really like retro at that point. Some of it was just sort of contemporary, but you, for example, there was the trad wife, there was the daughter Judy, who was a stereotypical teenager of the time, essentially kind of a baby boomer type of teenager who was always talking on the phone and going to dances and stuff. You would imagine all of these amazing technologies and things, but it was still very much the social structure, the financial structure of really 1950s era families and society. And it's interesting to sort of compare that to their sort of contemporary slash counterpart of the Flintstones, where we're in prehistory or something, and yet the wife is still wearing pearls. And instead of having the robot vacuum, you've got a dinosaur tied to a stick that you use as a vacuum. But the essential like question underneath that of like, well, what are men and women's relationships to each other, what are parents and kids relationships to each other, is very different. And I think that it's interesting sometimes to look at science fiction that really questions that kind of thing, because a lot of the sort of space opera-y stuff is not really necessarily looking to question that. But you get into interesting territory when you are working in more of a like a Brave New World kind of mode, where it's both utopia and not utopia. I mean, utopia, the word originated with the book written in the 16th century, I believe, of a man traveling to another country where everything was done differently because he was so frustrated with the politics of England in the 16th century that he was like, no, there's a better way to do this and this. But your imagination about that kind of thing is very much always limited by the context that you're coming out of. One thing that I thought was relevant to this discussion was there is a book, or actually a duology of books, by a writer named Tanith Lee, who I think is really due for a reconsideration as an influential sci-fi and fantasy writer. She's sometimes been discussed recently as an influence on Neil Gaiman and the Sandman series. But one of her more sci-fi duologies that I think is really interesting and relevant to today. Usually you find it published with both books together as Biting the Sun. The first book is Don't Bite the Sun, and the second book is Drinking Sapphire Wine. But it's set in extreme far future, not really sure if it's Earth or another planet. Everybody is living on bubble cities, and outside there's just sort of desert that once contained civilization, but that's all been abandoned now. So archaeologists will sometimes go out and look at the things out there. But other than that, we're very much living in bubble cities. And the thing that's interesting in that world, I was looking at it on Wikipedia, and it says that it was written in the 70s. And as a feminist author, Tanith Lee was very much involved in a movement that was looking at dystopias, and specifically soul-crushing dystopias. And Wikipedia was saying, but this series is more of a soul-crushing utopia, because the humans are all, once again, under the control of AI, basically. And their lives are essentially all play. So you have sort of periods of stages of life that you will stay in until you're basically done with that and then move on. And if you really, really get tired of it, then you can do a memory wipe, a complete memory wipe and ego death. But the main character of the series is in the adolescent stage of her life, which is very influenced by like 1960s, 1970s youth culture. Tanith Lee was British, so it's more of a like a mod kind of youth culture. And this is the Jang period of life where you run around and are constantly changing bodies. You can design your own body, you can switch gender, you can have short-term relationships with people, although you officially get married just to have a sexual encounter every time. It's frowned upon not to, but then you can divorce shortly thereafter. And one of the things that I find really interesting was like, there's no money, but if you want something basically in a shop, you kind of have to do a performance of how much you want it and how excited you are to have it in kind of like almost an influencer kind of way of like, oh my gosh, these earrings are so amazing. Thank you so much, etc. So, and you would go through and you would have this very sort of youthful, constantly changing bodies, constantly playing games and virtual reality settings and stuff with your little sort of group of people that you grew up with. And then gradually, after a certain number of decades, you would transition into being a grown up, basically. I forget what the term was for that. And it's ultimately very interesting. The soul crushing utopia of it all is when the main character gradually realizes that as much as she can do anything she wants, none of it really is meaningful. And so she keeps sort of reaching for something to give her life meaning, to feel like she's making a contribution. And she tries to have a job and she has a pet for a while and she thinks, oh, well, maybe I should have a kid, etc. And just keeps finding that actually the society is not designed for that because that would inherently challenge the ability of the society to function as it is. So I think that it's a really interesting series. There are some things that have aged better than others, but I think that there's always a question with utopias of, okay, if this is a perfect setting, then where is the conflict? Where is the story coming from? I know that that was an issue on Star Trek, again, back to Star Trek, that in the early seasons of The Next Generation, Gene Roddenberry, who was the creator of the series, of the Star Trek universe, was very insistent that, oh no, these two characters wouldn't get into an argument about this because we've evolved as a civilization and we no longer have such petty conflicts. And it sometimes was even in aspects of life where you're kind of like, I'm not sure that that's a good utopian thing. Like, for example, if a character had a family member die, Roddenberry was trying to say, oh, well, you know, they wouldn't be acting out in grief or they wouldn't be experiencing grief. We don't need to do a whole plot about that because they would just adjust to it because they're so evolved. And of course, what that inherently does is it cuts off a huge amount of potential conflict and potential story by kind of making the characters much less relatable. So they ultimately gradually complicated the utopia of Star Trek. And there are people who think that it went too far the other way, that Star Trek became too dark and gritty. I'm a big fan of Deep Space Nine, which I think is the series that had the best balance of utopia versus actually we should think about this a little bit more in its conflicts.
For my generation, I think utopias have been quite non-existent. I don't know, just the ones that I have been exposed to have been utopian, but not necessarily. So, for example, Black Mirror, notoriously about taking the dangers of future technology and society to the extreme. The endings of the episodes of this show can be either hopeful or tragic. Most of them are tragic. However, there are a couple notable episodes where they do have happy endings that kind of represent some sort of utopia, and there's always a but at the end. So for one episode, San Junipero, there's two women who fall in love in a 1980s nightclub, and they have great chemistry, they hit it off, they get together. But in reality, you realize, oh, also spoilers ahead for people who haven't seen these episodes. Please watch them. But in reality, these two women are actually the consciousness of two real life women who are actually older women who are living their dreams out of being young and free to be their authentic selves. So in this episode, in this world, the consciousness of the dead and the elderly can be uploaded into a newly developed virtual reality system called San Junipero. It's kind of like modern day we do have VR rooms and such and stuff like that, but this is like your entire soul, your all of your data basically being turned into a robot, and you can choose whether to die naturally or whether or not people upload your quote unquote self to San Junipero. But ultimately, the two women in this story end up happily ever after, except in the final shot of the episode, they slowly show a shot of this massive server room that's just electronically maintained by robots forever. And that's to represent that that is who you might become in this future where you just become virtual reality. And it's this question of, sure, we can have a utopia virtually, and it can be beautiful, and you can share loads of wonderful connection, and everything is perfect. But it's at the cost of maybe your humanity or your morals or what you actually are in reality. So I think this episode is meant to say that yes, technology can provide us a utopia, and the end, question mark. And then there's the other notable episode, Nosedive, where everybody has a social media implant that ranks and reviews each other on a scale of 1 to 5 in their heads. And anyone who has below a certain score does not have as much access to resources. Doors literally will not open for you if you're like below a certain number. And the whole design of this world is that it's all in pastel colors, which is supposed to be disarming and perfect. And I think that's what I think of when I think of a utopia, is everything in pastel colors, bright daytime, people are smiling all the time, and that's basically what this world is. And your 5-star ranking, it's kind of like if everybody were to rate you on an Uber level, like how you rate your Uber drivers, if everybody else rated each other like that all the time, that is the key to basically obtaining a good boyfriend, a good career, a beautiful home, and having a family, etc. So there's this pressure of looking your best all the time, including with your weight, your smile, your physical activity, and it can definitely take a negative toll on your mental health, a la social media of the modern day, like Instagram and Facebook, and how the numbers of followers and likes and basically numberifying everything can make it seem simple and streamlined and perfect. And like you do have this momentary joy of being rich on attention and rich on approval. But this episode does take a tragic turn as the main character basically has accidents that snowball into her losing her rank more and more and more. And then she ultimately has the decision of whether to choose to step away from all of this ranking in social media and to choose freedom, or to actually continue to live in this illusion. It's the Matrix metaphor where there's like a red pill and a blue pill. She literally drinks from a red thermos on the middle of the highway at one point, and that symbolizes that she chooses to be free. And at the end, she ends up in a gray prison cell, which is very different from the pastels of the world. But she's finally able to actually smile for real and to say whatever she wants without consequence. And I think this is very much what my generation has grown up with, is that we've grown up with wanting to be part of the pastel world, but the lesson of this utopia is that it's flawed and that it's not a utopia. And the real utopia is where you are free to be yourself at no cost to yourself, and to be more free than the rest of the world by rejecting what the overall idea of utopia might be. So it's a little meta, but there's my 25-year-old perspective on it.
Hey, yeah, absolutely. I forgot to mention, by the way, speaking of Star Trek, the holodeck or holosuite, which are also kind of utopic spaces. And Avery, like you were talking about, they sort of break down. Sometimes characters escape from the holodeck, or sometimes people go a little too deep into the holosuite or the holodeck and they sort of get lost. They lose themselves in the VR. So very much what we were all talking about, like whose utopia? And for how long and for what purpose. And I think that's kind of fascinating. The question of, is this what we really want, right? This
Yeah.
sounds good, but what could possibly go wrong?
I think it's interesting also in terms of the generational difference. In some ways, the concept of, oh, well, this utopia is not truly a utopia is kind of built into the premise, but also I think that, yes, it's become harder and harder to really imagine that the future is going to look this ideal
Mm,
way. And I think that there is very much political valence to that, where the idea of being red pilled has gotten very loaded, perhaps in a way that was not intended by the original creators of The Matrix. But the concept that actually what we need to do is return to reality and to be your true self, etc., is something that can be taken in very different directions based on your worldview. So sometimes, obviously it was not the intention of the creators of the Matrix to do this, but I think there's potentially even sort of a fascist direction that can go in, where actually all of this experimentation, all of this freedom is the foolish utopia that can only lead to ruin. Whereas, getting back to the nuclear family and their imagined version of what the world can be is the thing that will really save us. One of the things that happens a lot in the sort of questioning utopia type of science fiction, like I think the classic example is Brave New World, is that there will frequently be this outsider who comes in, usually a man, usually from a less developed world, and he and his hairy chest will come in and solve whatever the problem is that is threatening to defeat the soft femme people of the future. There's also, there's stuff like that in the Time Machine, where there's the gap between all of the future people are either sort of the aristocrats who have evolved into the Eloi, who are soft and beautiful and vegan and surrounded by pastels all the time, and then the Morlocks who live under the ground, who have evolved from poor people who are the miners and stuff. And you find out, twist for a 100-year-old book, that actually the Morlocks come up and hunt the Eloi and use them for food, basically. So part of the utopia that's there is artificial. And so the time traveling scientist with the time machine comes in and fights the evil Morlocks and gets the beautiful Aloy girl. It's okay, for you to be soft and feminine if you're a girl, but if you want actual action, you have to have a strong, manly man. So I think that there's always a direction that you can go when you're talking about this stuff. And I think that it's very built in to the culture right now because we have had a number of extremely popular dystopias as part of popular fiction. I think that that really has influenced the worldviews of a lot of people in terms of what is possible in the future, and also like what would having more freedom potentially lead to. Would that be a good thing, or does it just need to be shut down and we need to get back to basics kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dystopias. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Rise of the dystopia. A few that I wanted to point out. A classic is 1984, where the government has taken over everybody's lives and has complete control. So this was George Orwell looking at World War II and what was going on both in fascist states of Italy and Germany, and then also what was going on in the communist Soviet Union. Brazil, which was a crazy movie from the 1980s that I have a lot of affection for, about how the government is kind of trying to take care of all the technology, but also people are fascinated by things like plastic surgery and the fun ways that they can go out and have a good time. And then, of course, this is one of the rich and poor things. Again, the poor folks are involved in like a never-ending struggle against terrorism, never-ending struggle against poverty. V for Vendetta, classic, and V for Vendetta has sort of gotten it changed. The graphic novel was more about anarchy and the movie was more about revolution, and like, no, I actually have an idea of how to overthrow the government, but not in an anarchistic way, like in a way that would make things better for people. So these questions of, okay, what happened to get to this dystopia? What have we done? And how do we survive? And here I'm looking at Fallout. Oh my gosh, computer game series that now has become a streaming a series on streaming. And again, we're mid-century. I don't know what it is about mid-century, but again, we're mid-century. And people have retreated to vaults if they were rich enough or if they were part of a specific experiment. If they were not, then they were on the surface and they got radiation and mutated. And there are characters called ghouls who are just kind of a shadow of their former selves, and they have kind of some ability to act like they would have acted as a human and some not. But the idea of how do we cope with scavengers? How do we cope with radiation? What happens when we come out of the vault? What do we find? So dangerous. It's dangerous. Or maybe we're looking at despair and what's going to happen when we recognize how much trouble we're really in. So, Brooke, a couple of dystopias that you resonate with?
I think the dystopias that I tend to resonate with the most are the ones that are coming out of current trends. The first one that came to mind was the world of Alien and the Alien movies. It seems like they're actually going to make a new TV show version that's set on Earth there, and to give you a sense of what it is like for the people who are living on Earth. And I think that could be really good or really bad, really. So we'll have to see. But I think the thing that's going on in the Alien movies is that corporations have just been allowed to take everything over. Human life is at the mercy of the forces of capitalism and profit, etc. And so the situations that they're getting into, the obvious antagonist is the alien monsters, who are very cool and very neatly designed with the H.R. Geiger crazy, very alien designs. But the real reason that the human characters are in that situation is that they are at the mercy of this extremely uncaring society that wants to get alien tech or wants to colonize another planet or whatever, and therefore doesn't really care if random people die in the process. So I feel like that's kind of a dystopia that I find more relatable in some ways. In the 1950s, one of the things that was the exciting living in the future stuff was the new technology for housekeeping. And you had vacuums and you had electric lights and you had dishwashers and washing machines and all of this stuff. And there was this constant refrain of, oh, it'll free up all of your time. Well, what happened instead was you were held to a higher, in some cases, extremely unrealistic level of homemaking as a woman, as a housewife, where everything just had to be completely spotless all the time. And so did your outfit, and so did your whole presentation. But also, that time saving device sometimes would break down, or sometimes would cause additional problems, or you just would take that time and have it now be put into a job because you could no longer live in as a trad wife type of person. The more time consuming tasks were not taking up as much time, then there wasn't as much value in just having you be around the house all the time, so people would get bored and want to do other things. It's really helpful when you're looking at dystopias to be able to see, like, what are the patterns of history when you get some kind of amazing new technology. Does it actually revolutionize the world? Does it actually create a wonderful post-scarcity universe, or does it just become another way that there can be a divide between rich and poor, between the sexes, between all kinds of different cultural groups? So I think that's something that I find compelling in dystopias.
Yeah, and there's always that element of control from some other being. Like, I also did read 1984, The Giver, Brave New World, and Fahrenheit 451 during school. And boy, oh boy, the amount of fascism and desire for control over people's thoughts was a really recurring theme. Like in Fahrenheit 451, basically books are outlawed and firemen have the job of burning books and houses that hide books. And the protagonist, who's a fireman, ends up quitting his job, fighting the system, and then preserving literature instead. And the other thing about dystopias is that they're always also about the present day in some way, shape, or form. For example, in the past couple decades, people have had ethnic studies programs in schools. Specifically, Tucson, Arizona schools had one that was focused for Mexican American students to learn about their heritage and to learn about, the literature and academics around being Mexican American and how to fight oppression and all that wonderful stuff. But of course, the local school boards found that to be dangerous and thus wanted to censor them, thus banning the books that were part of their scholarship, such as Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, which I read during my undergrad, and also banning books like The History of Mexican Civil Rights Movement by Arturo Rosales, Critical Race Theory by Richard Delgado, and so many more. And I now have an itch to reread all these books that we're talking about because this is just really fascinating. But it's all about the desire to censor people to keep them marginalized, basically. I'm currently working on a show for The City and the City, which is a book by China Mieville. And this story is about two cities whose borders overlap each other in very confusing ways. And there's this law where you're not allowed to see or interact with somebody from the other city, which is right next to you every single day. And there's this mysterious force that keeps this law in place that's called breach. And they basically prevent you from crossing over the borders. Even if you do it accidentally, you get in a lot of trouble. You basically can get deported. And it's all about the surveillance of these people. So that's another theme in dystopias too, is like constantly being watched. Your brain is being watched, your eyes are being watched, your body, everything is at risk of putting you as a criminal. And the question of the city and the city is like, what do we unsee in our daily lives today? How are ways that our borders prevent us from truly connecting with other people or being free to be who we want to be? And then last, there's a game called Stray, where you play a stray cat in a desolate cyberpunk future. It's a video game, it's beautiful. You're basically an orange cat and you're lost all alone without your family. And you get to explore these neon lit alleys of a decaying cyber city called Walled City 99. Another theme of dystopias and utopias, honestly, is like walls. What are the walls that we put up around us? What are they trying to protect us from? And in this walled city, it's inhabited by a bunch of curious droids, but also dangerous creatures, and you get to befriend a drone called B12, and you get to just be a cat. You get to climb up and down all these buildings and down into the sewers and explore, and you're basically trying to solve this ancient mystery of this walled city of like, why is this wall here and what is it protecting from? And ultimately at the end you get to reveal the powers that are controlling this city and reveal that you can actually remove the roof over everything and bring in sunlight again. And I think that's the my final touch on the dystopian themes is that it's all about taking down walls when they are too much, when they control you to an overextensive degree, and also making the decision to free yourself, but ultimately releasing yourself into the great unknown at the same time.
Yeah, I've seen shots from that game and it really looks amazing. I'm a big fan of
Yeah,
cats
it's
anyway,
gorgeous.
so in regard to Fahrenheit 451, one of the things that I was thinking about this morning was there's a lot of conversation always about the way that language changes and the backlash to there being new words or new vocabulary to describe marginalized groups, etc., or to make things less gendered, and always a backlash to that. But one thing that I was thinking about this morning in regard to Fahrenheit 451 is that the firemen there, as you mentioned, are there to start fires. They are there to burn books. And in the common vocabulary that we have now, you usually call such a person a firefighter. And that was something that changed, I think, when I was a kid in the 90s, that there was a sort of conscious effort to open up language, and you don't say congressman, you say congress member, or congressman, man or woman. And one of the things was fireman being transitioned to firefighter. Some of that stuff, there was a certain spaghetti being thrown at the wall quality to, and some of that stuff didn't really stick. But one of the things that I think is a little bit nicer, a little bit hopeful, is that the fireman is not called the fireman. They're called firefighters now, and therefore fireman doesn't contain the concept of what I'm doing is putting out fires in the same way that firefighter does. So in some ways
Yeah.
it seems like potentially that linguistic thing is no longer in effect, is no longer working. I can't quite articulate what I mean, but it just seems a little bit hopeful to me that inherent in the word now is, we're putting the fires out. We're not burning the books. That's not what the job is.
And we've been kind of dancing around this, but I think we can directly address it. The idea of science fiction or thinking about the future or thinking about what inventions are going to come next as social commentary. There's a long, long history of science fiction being connected with social commentary. The mother of science fiction, Mary Shelley with Frankenstein, the question of playing God. I think both of you touched on this a little bit. And I love that line in Jurassic Park where Jeff Goldblum's character says, "You were so caught up in thinking about whether you could that you didn't stop to think about whether you should." And he like bangs the table in front of him. And it's just kind of this resonant idea that I think has followed us. Should we do this? Should we do this? Should we do this? So H.G. Wells, you were talking about Time Machine, and a whole bunch of Wells's stories were about what are our responsibilities as humans with technology becoming more and more important and woven into our lives. Rod Serling, I've talked about Rod Serling before, one of my personal heroes and a guy who I don't think gets enough recognition, but the creator of The Twilight Zone, a Jewish American creative writer and a person who was directly attacking issues that were going on post World War II in terms of the civil rights movement, in terms of war, in terms of class, and was told, "Hey, you can't do this just directly with movies or shows that are about the direct questions of civil rights or poverty." And so he said, "Okay, well, fine. Then I'll do it through fantasy and horror and science fiction." And so created just I really think opened the door for more and more popular culture to explore social justice and social commentary through metaphor, right? And that science fiction became a very, very powerful tool to open that up. Movies like Blade Runner, movies like Ex Machina, a whole bunch of challenges with what do we want to turn over in terms of technology. We've been talking about AI quite consistently. I mean, Kubrick's 2001, right, based on Arthur C. Clarke's 2001, HAL the computer that kills people, kind of a precursor to, like you were talking about, the corporation in Alien. And spoiler alert for those of you, again, who haven't seen a movie from the 70s, that the only artificial person on the ship in the first Alien movie is programmed to kill the crew members in order to get the alien back, crew expendable. So I think that this is a commentary that's been going on for a long time. In Ex Machina, it's about, like you both, I think, mentioned, what are our responsibilities to the artificial intelligences that we create? The Oscar Isaac character basically has created artificial women in order to do what kind of whatever he wants with them, dance with them, or have them as companions, or really whatever. But he also has the ability to turn them off, or to dismantle them, or to create the next version of them. And then I also think of the classic Isaac Asimov Three Laws of Robotics. Let me see if I remember them off the top of my head. First, a robot shall not kill a human being. Second, a robot shall fulfill its objectives as long as that does not interfere with rule number one. Rule number three, a robot shall ensure its own survival as long as that does not interfere with law number two or law number one, right? So this is Asimov starting to think about how are we going to keep ourselves safe from these robots or what would eventually become AI that we are creating. And my partner and I just saw this really interesting quasi immersive play, which was a trial. It was called The Jury. And so we were the jury in a case, a criminal case, where the CEO of a driverless taxi service was they were trying to find him criminally negligent because the taxi, this was a trolley problem kind of thing, right? The taxi, in order to avoid a head on collision that would kill its passengers and the passengers of the car that was swerving into its lane, went into the path of a cyclist and killed the cyclist. So this is an like AI trolley problem kind of thing. And the question was, okay, who should be held accountable for decisions that are made by an AI? And this is really interesting, guys, because this is now at our front door. These were sort of academic questions maybe a couple years ago, but now, oh my gosh, there are cars that can literally hurt us if the algorithms. I'm not saying that cars are programmed with these algorithms. I'm just saying this is what the trial was about. So, potentially, this is an area where who is responsible becomes a really serious question. And so I think it's going to be fascinating to see this question sort of in the near future continue to become relevant and become kind of a maybe a proving ground for some social issues, like what does a corporation owe people, what is a human's life worth? Like all of these questions. So, social commentary. Over to you, Brooke.
Well, I think it's really interesting you brought up the three laws of robotics, because I think inherent to that is the fact that the robot's own survival is like third priority, number three under the top priority of a human, and also it continuing to do its job. One of the things that I think we talk about right now with AI is it's very much a misnomer in terms of what the actual technology is. Large language models are able to predict speech, but they're not, at least in my non expert opinion, they're not actually thinking per se, even though it's very, very common, sometimes even for people in the field to talk as though they are thinking beings. And so I don't think that we've gotten quite to the point where we're treating the AI as disposable people. In some ways, I kind of suspect that the world would be a little bit better if we were using AI to do jobs that humans either can't do or that are very unpleasant. One of the things that I usually say is I will believe that the purpose of this AI is actually to make my life better when it's doing things like cleaning the bathroom and scrubbing around the toilet, as opposed to writing or making music or all of the things that are actually good and meaningful in human experience, it seems to want to do. And there's some sort of presumption that there will just be some kind of social divide where the few millionaires are constantly surrounded by AI assistants who can make their lives perfect in all other ways. And then there's this huge underclass of people who are just doing the grunt work of agriculture and cleaning and all of that stuff. And that's a big, just because we can doesn't mean we should kind of question right there.
Yeah.
And then I think also in terms of considering people as disposable potentially, one of the big social influences is The Handmaid's Tale, which has been enormously influential, especially since the TV show came out. Also because it came out at the same time as 2016 other things were happening politically. And so that imagery from that show was used very much in protests. And you still do see women in the handmaid garb at protests pretty frequently. But it's also interesting because I think that some of the choices that they made in adapting the book into the TV show have kind of flattened the message in some ways. For example, in the book, it's very explicitly a white Christian nationalist nation that they're in, and people of other races have largely been, taken off to work in nuclear radiated sites. And the TV show, both to enable there to not just be a whole bunch of white actors interacting solely with white actors, and I think to sort of widen the appeal, they didn't really include the white supremacy aspects of the story. So that's one thing that gets left off. And then there's a non-zero number of people, especially conservatives or young men who really do not understand as much about history as they think they do, who have looked at the world of The Handmaid's Tale and thought, oh, actually, that seems great. So I think there's always a danger in presenting the way the world can be. Margaret Atwood always talked about how everything that she was having happen in that world was something that had previously happened either in history or contemporary events, like with the Iranian Revolution, the really rapid change to a theocratic society from a very kind of modern and progressive society. And that was what she was basing it on. But I think that, again, in some ways it got flattened by adaptation, even though I think it was, at least in the first season, a very good adaptation. People just sort of saw it as, oh, well, this can't possibly ever happen, or at least it can't happen to white people. And so it's frequently brought up, online or something. If you think that rights are being taken away from you as a woman or something, there is a number of commentators online who will always make some kind of Handmaid's Tale reference. And it's like, I think that maybe we're a little bit farther down the road and also on a slightly different road as far as where things are with that. So it's maybe possible to overuse it or use it inappropriately without really understanding the full context of that story. But it's also still one that's very relevant.
Another dystopian series that has played a large part in my life has been the Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins. It's set in post-apocalyptic North America, where all of this nation of Panem is divided and controlled by the capital, who are the rich overdogs who are all dressed in fancy clothing and rely on the essentially slave labor of the districts to survive. And according to the author, this book series is an allegory of just war theory for children to understand, basically. And there is a love triangle in this series, which is the main reason that people might push it off as more of like a Twilight thing, or, oh, I'm Team Gale, or I'm Team PETA. But it's not about just the love triangle. So just war theory is about essentially questions what circumstances give you the moral right to wage war and what is acceptable behavior within that war and its aftermath. So PETA, the blonde guy, represents conscience, which is always having to do the right thing no matter what. That's who he is. Gale, on the other hand, the brunette guy, he represents rage and vengeance, which is about how any action is ethical enough to free your people. Basically, for Gale, the ends justify the means. So Katniss, our female protagonist, is in the middle, trying to balance out how to proceed between these two extremes in the context of war, in the context of oppression, marginalization, and all of the stuff that's happening to her districts. And even though these are all teenagers at the time and they have to deal with kids getting, aside from everything else, they have to deal with kids getting thrown into these battle royale games. And it's not just about, yeah, like I said, it's not just about the love triangle, it's about this kind of allegory. And I think that's what all of dystopian and futuristic fiction is trying to do, is just to be an allegory for how we should behave in our real lives and our present day lives.
All right, time for some final thoughts, everybody. We've looked at this from a number of different perspectives. I also want to give a shout out to the idea that different cultures around the world have their own visions of the future for the future. Today we have mostly stuck in a sort of Western framework. If you look, of course, if you look at Japan and you look at Ghost in the Shell or Neon Genesis Evangelion or Akira, right? These are very different views of the future. Post war Japan, I mean, my gosh, there is just. There is so much in terms of even like Godzilla, right? Or all the monster movies. Like, how did the nuclear age envision the future?
They were
Um,
dealing with a lot socially that they had to digest.
Absolutely. And Latin America and the way that Latin America looks at the future, or India, or if you look at the Middle East and North Africa, everybody's going to imagine the future in a way that makes sense for where their society is, where they want it to go, and probably where they don't want it to go. So, just kind of this, I mean, thinking about the future, thinking about science fiction, thinking about the near future, thinking about being playful, is very much a global phenomenon, even though it you could argue that it started in the West. I don't think that's a great argument, but I think the sort of mainline idea is that these sorts of adventures in creative writing and in play started in the West and then influenced other civilizations to kind of think about, oh, how do we feel about science fiction? But oh my gosh, you go back into mythology and non-Western mythology, and there is what we might call science fiction all over the place. So just wanted to kind of acknowledge that. My final thoughts here. Okay, all right, folks, one more time going back to Ian Banks, because I really do love the guy. So he actually called science fiction the most important genre. Why did he say this? Because it explored the human condition and it did something for society. It helped society understand itself, and it also helped society prepare for change. What was going to come next, and what did we need to be doing? Great Ursula Le Guin, who wrote both fantasy and science fiction and wrote a number of amazing essays. Another hero, right? Ursula Le Guin said, it can show us who we are and where we are and what choices face us with unsurpassed clarity and with a great and troubling beauty. I love that, you guys. I absolutely love that. And so I think both of these folks are suggesting that playing through where we are going has power. We are powered by play and has importance. And questions like, do we want to choose this path or that path? What will happen given either decision? What is our humanity? What is our relationship with technology? And where is our hope? Sometimes in the bigness of what we are going through right now, right? What can we hope for in a world that sometimes, dare I say, seems to be going in the wrong direction? Those are my final thoughts. Over to you.
I don't know that I really have anything to top that. That was very good summary of all the things that we talked about and great quote. So I don't know that I have much more to say.
All right, Avery, what do you think?
That was also beautifully put as usual, Drew. My final thought is a recommendation of the music album Give Me the Future by Bastille, who's one of my favorite bands. This album is all about technology and the way that it influences us and us dive. It's basically a playful, dancey vibe and dive into the future. And some of the lyrics of one of the songs is, why would we leave? Why would we leave? Miles and miles of fake beauty. It's good for you. It's good for me. Why would we leave? And with that, I would like to end off the episode. Thank you so much again, Brooke, for joining
Thank
us
you for
on
having
this
me.
special episode. And to our listeners, thanks for listening, and we will see you all next time.
This has been Powered by Play with Avery and Drew. If you've been enjoying this podcast, you can support us online at Ko-fi. That is ko-fi.com/poweredbyplay. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.